Welcome back to the channel, guys. This is a pre-recorded interview with Tim Ventura, futurist, technologist, business executive, podcaster, and founder and moderator of the APEC Conference. Please check out the links below this video for all of Tim's work and his podcast. And I hope you enjoy this interview. If you do, please remember to leave a like rating and subscribe to the channel if you don't already. I hope you enjoy this interview with Tim Ventura. So, Tim, I wanted to really start off by asking you what sparked your initial interest in UAP, and do you think it is an important field of research?
Well, if it's okay, so I have kind of an odd story to that. I actually saw a UFO in
Wow.
1996. I saw what they called the stealth blimp, and I don't want to go into the site. I would say that I had a very close-up sighting of it, but that didn't convince me. In fact, I thought that it was one of ours, and I'd read online later that that was some kind of a Navy observation platform or something. I went along with things, but I'd always had this interest in physics and propulsion and science. And I ended up starting American Anti-Gravity in 2002. And the focus there was on emerging propulsion, right? New propulsion and, anti-gravity, B-field, Brown effect, the Searle effect out of the UK, lots and lots of different ideas. And I ended up interviewing and covering pretty much that entire field. And there's massive overlap there with UAP. And so, being thick-headed as I am, I spent years doing this intensely and built a pretty good reputation, a pretty big following, did a lot of media. And the more that I dug into UAP, the less I was able to find that was credible. I met a lot of the key figures there, and I'm like, I see a lot of smoke. I don't see any fire. So after all of that, I still didn't believe in UAP, right? And so, again, I'm the last person to figure some things out. I'll admit that. So in 2007, the Nimitz or 2017, the Nimitz story broke, right? I started to see those. And I'm like, "Ah, okay, yeah, it could be the pilots, could be this, could be that." And I have I've been doing a lot of defense interviews. I do a lot of writing. I work with a lot of scientists. And the people that I trusted with credentials, PhDs, military figures, folks along those lines, they'd stop me and they said, "No, no, no, you got to take a close look at this. This is something real." I was like, it's UFOs, right? That's not real. But I did. I started to look at it, and I started to review like Kevin Newth and the SCU, their analysis, and I started to look at the reports, and I did research on the military reports. And the more I read, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't somebody who saw a light in the sky and said, "Oh, look, it's aliens." This isn't something that you can write off as for instance, night terrors, I think, right? That's what
Sure.
abduction experiences have been written off as. I said, this is these are military reports. It's highly credible. They have multiple types of overlapping sensor data. And, the more that you research, the more that you find. I was like, my God, this is real. And so for me, it it took a while to kinda come to that conclusion, but I would say it was 2018, 2019, I had this emotional moment of, "This is real," and in some ways, that's still going on for me, and the reason I mention that is I have a feeling that that's something that's going on for most people, if not all people. I mean, there are many individuals, perhaps yourself, who are like, "You know what? UFOs are real. I'm cool with it." But for the rest of us, it's kinda like it's one of those cultural things, right? Like,
Sure.
yeah, 1950s stuff in the air, maybe, maybe not. And it's like, well, wait a minute, it's real? Like, really real? That's that's a lot, you know? So
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. I
so
appreciate that.
that's kind of my backstory. Hopefully that wasn't too drawn out. But
No,
the
that's
reason I
perfect.
yeah, I wanted to share that because I know a lot of people have a low bar for acceptance, and that's fine. That's everybody has their own criteria, right?
Yeah.
But for a lot of folks, they're like, okay, somebody told me that UFOs are real, therefore they are. In my case, it was the opposite. I had studied this. I had a lot of knowledge. I worked with a lot of really credible people, and I was just like, just dismissive, and it was the overwhelming amount of evidence. And I would say, over the last couple of years, it's just gotten more and more and more overwhelming. So, they're here. I mean, what else can we say? And they may have been here for a very, very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And through your conversations that you've had in the past few years, and there's a lot of people tend to theorize about the actual origin of the non-human intelligence. Do you sort of lean more towards any specific theory, whether it be extraterrestrial, interdimensional, and a whole multitude of others?
So this is again, I've done a lot of interviews. I've done an interview series and I've heard a lot of different opinions. And so I kind of benefit from that because I'm able to think about what different people say and go, okay, how do I feel about this? And I'm leaning towards the alien hypothesis. And actually, I'm leaning towards machine intelligence, but I want to put a caveat on that because um, so the idea was like for anybody who's watched Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 Space Odyssey, that was what they call a von Neumann probe. It's a
Sure.
self-replicating machine, right, that travels the galaxy. And we are far more likely to encounter those than anything else. And the reason why is, okay, let's assume for a moment that you're on planet X, right? And you want to explore the galaxy. You can produce UFOs, as fast as you want. The problem is those UFOs have to have crews, they have to have a pilot, right? Even if they're, faster than light, they can get there instantly. It still takes time to explore the galaxy. The amount of time, the amount of production, the amount of like labor involved is daunting. You wouldn't be able to explore that much at all. Whereas with the von Neumann probe, within 50 replication events, you could explore all 400 billion stars in the Milky Way. So it's just far more likely that, I mean, maybe there are Planet X aliens sending saucers out there with, little guys with antennas, but um it's far less likely that we encounter them than we initially encounter a machine. Now, it's entirely possible that the machine showed up and it's been here and it sent a signal home and said, "Hey, guess what? There's life here." That
Mm.
could be what's going on. And then I think another aspect to this is when you're talking about civilizations that are thousands, millions, tens of millions of years more advanced than ours, the word machine and biological and intelligence, those terms probably don't mean the same thing that we tend to think. So yeah, so machine is probably a loose way to describe it. I mean, but that's probably the best word I can use, I guess.
Yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from with that. I mean, in your opinion, as the awareness and understanding of this subject does increase, how do you think it could potentially impact, society and culture at large?
Well, I think there's going to be a tremendous impact, but it reminds me of I've read this about earthquakes. I'm in the Seattle area. We don't have too many, but we've had a couple of big ones. We had one that was kind of sharp, right? And it's like this sharp jar, and it hits you, and you're like, okay, wow, there's an earthquake going on. With the UAP phenomena, I think that this realization is more like one of those deep rolling quakes. And I went through one of those too. And at first it's like something's going on, and then it takes a while and you're like, oh, okay. I think that's the UAP phenomena. And I think that for a couple of reasons. Um, One of them is this has been a part of our culture for over 70 years, right? I mean, the 1950s was the heyday, and it's been on the silver screen, it's been on television, it's been in comic books and magazines, maybe intentionally. Maybe that was the reason that they put it there, was to warm people up to it. So I think that there's going to be a transition period for people to realize, hey, this isn't just Will Smith in Independence Day punching out an alien. This is real life, that we actually have neighbors that are visiting us. And so I think it's going to take a while to kind of penetrate the popular consciousness, but that's probably a good thing, you know? And again, maybe that was intended. There have been all those rumors about Spielberg, right? Maybe that was the whole plan, was to warm people up to it so that they don't freak out.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good point. Do you think maybe the religious and philosophical believers may react slightly differently to kind of the general public?
You know, I have heard stories, this was back in the 1970s and 80s, I guess, that there were people in US Congress saying UFOs were demons. And
Yeah.
to me, that just seems silly. I mean, it just seems silly, you know? And it's not to be dismissive of religion. It's just I I don't know. Those seem incredibly incongruent with each other. And I think the more that we learn about UAP and these visitors, I think the more apparent that will be, you know? I mean, again, I'm not saying that there aren't demons. I'm pretty darn sure this isn't it.
Yeah, fair enough. And do you think there should be some ethical considerations that we should consider when it comes to making contact with a non-human intelligence? I mean, especially if they're more advanced than us.
You know, it's an excellent point. We've already made contact. We've already attempted to make contact. I think one of the interesting things is they probably know us a lot better than we think they know us, you know? And again, I think there's part of an acceptance thing there. Um, so I did an interview with Sean Cahill, who was part of the Nimitz crew, and he is very close to Luis Elizondo, right? And so apparently they both went down to Ensenada in Baja California, which is near where the Nimitz event happened.
Yeah.
And they wanted to see if they could get any stories. Well, from what he had told me, the local fishing village there sees these things all the time. He'd said that they weren't even surprised. He said, you know, we were on the ship and we saw these tic tacs and they looked like this and it was the craziest thing. And the fishermen were just like, oh, yeah, yeah, that happens all the time here, you know, so much so that it's a part of the local folklore. It goes back quite a ways. And so if that's the case, you know, these intelligences are well aware of us, you know, they're probably aware of, you know, how we react, how we're developing, things like that. At least some of them. And again, maybe there are others that are a little bit newer, but it seems like they are probably taking greater care with us as a young species than we are, having little to no clue what's going on, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, another good point. I've spoken to sort of local indigenous people in Colombia, and to them, it is like you said, it's just part of their everyday life. It's just accepted. There's no stigma. There's no taboo, and I think we forget that in some of these cultures that we're immersed in. So yeah, really interesting point there. I was going to ask, what role do you think artificial intelligence and machine learning will play as the UAP subject grows, I suppose, with more data coming in? Do you think that that will benefit the research and study of the subject?
Yeah, I think tremendously. I mean, you know, I'm sure you've seen this with Chat GPT, I think that's really kind of turned the world upside down. You know, that I think is another one of those disruptive, transformative technologies where we don't really know where it's going, right? And that's why they had that recent letter where they were calling for a global pause for 6 months. Um, there's a lot of good that could come out of it. It's just so much, so fast, and it's so unknown. And so, with UAP technologies, for instance, I did an interview with Don Tadaya a few weeks ago, and he is a Python programmer and a data scientist. He pulled the New Fork, the National UFO Center reporting database, 80,000 records. He was able to use 60,000 of those, and he did tons and tons of detailed trend charts on those, you know? And that's just one data set. And one of the challenges with that data is it is not perfect data, right? The
Right.
bright side is it goes back decades, but the downside is it's, you know, a lot of human hands have touched it. There are a lot of variables. There's false data, all sorts of stuff. Um, the same, I understand, is true for the MUFON database. He didn't look at that, but that's another one. And then as the military collects more and more of this data, they will have these databases to work with also, you know? And it's entirely possible that it may turn out that there are satellite photos, satellite data, radio telemetry. Um, my personal belief is that the military probably has data that they don't even know they have.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And do you think a disclosure of a non-human intelligence, do you think it would lead to advancements in not only technology, but also like medicine and energy and even the way that we kind of care for the environment, things like that?
I I hope so. It's I think that our perception of intelligence in general is changing, and I don't think it started with ET. I'd read a big article about our relationship as human beings with dogs, and that started to change in the 1980s. Before that, dogs were like an outdoor barnyard creature, right? And in the US, and I think in the UK and probably most of Europe, around that time, they started to come indoors. They became more a part of the family, right? And I think that was tied to lifestyle differences and things like that. But um, progressively, I think we have admitted that other forms of life on Earth are a lot more sentient, capable of a lot more emotion, right? A lot more alive than we believed in the past. In the past, it was kind of like, okay, well, it's these dumb creatures and we use them for food and that's all they're good for. And now we're starting to see, okay, they're missing some of our cognitive abilities, but they still have souls in that sense, you know? They still have emotions. They still have wants and needs, just not quite at the same level we do. And that's just life right here on Earth. And as we accept the fact that we're not alone, which isn't surprising. Again, with 400 billion stars, even if only a tiny fraction of those are capable of life, there could be thousands, potentially millions of civilizations out there, you know? And it ultimately does become a numbers game, but, starting with such a vast number of potential options, it's likely that there are creatures out there, and it's possible that they've encountered us. It definitely seems that way. I mean, the weight of the evidence points to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A word that's thrown around a lot with the UAP subject is consciousness. Do you have any kind of way of connecting consciousness to the UAP subject yourself?
I I'm pursuing a line of inquiry. Uh, I can kinda tell you where I'm going, and
Please.
I could be going way off track, right? But,
That's fine.
so l starting last year, I went gangbusters on UAP interviews, right? I started interviewing subject matter experts and, um, people who are close to that phenomena, especially witnesses, especially people who have seen them or interacted in some way, they come back to consciousness, right? And uh, they use it as a code word for basically psychic events. But like Skinwalker Ranch, the same thing. And in fact, when I did an interview with Gary Nolan, and he had said the same thing. He's like, it comes back to consciousness, and he's like, what the heck does that have to do with UFOs? And I said, you know, I, I don't know, but I'd like to find out. So I started doing some consciousness interviews, and what I've seen is there is a connection in the people who are close to it, and I don't know why. I have no idea why. Um, what I've wondered is if there are more physical laws, some kind of new physics that we're not aware of. It appears that there is. I did interviews with the Global Consciousness Project, um, and they actually have 25 years of data where when major news events hit the headlines, these random number generators, they're quantum-based number generators, register it, right? And so like September 11th was a major ping, or the
Yeah.
invasion of Iraq, things like that. And so there's an indication that there's something more there. And I guess my thought is that again, if these intelligences are tens of thousands or millions of years more advanced than us, they probably operate in that area or at least use that area. And maybe that's the connection.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. Do you think maybe there's a chance that the phenomena isn't necessarily a singular phenomena, that it could represent multiple phenomena?
Yes, absolutely. I avoid thinking about that too much because it will hurt my brain, to be
Yeah.
honest. It's one of those, you know, and people have said that. They've said, well, we're being visited by multiple species, right? And um, I mean, I guess if you want to take it a little bit farther out, there's what they call the zoo hypothesis, which
Yeah.
is basically the Star Trek Prime Directive, right? That aliens show up and they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, these humans aren't that advanced. We'll study them, but for God's sake, don't interact with them." And if that's the case, yeah, we could be visited by many, many different groups or species or planets or whatever you might call it. I try not to think about that too much because it's one of those things that is just like instant headache, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and in terms of studying it, then it makes it nearly impossible. It's why do they have 25 different types of ships and sightings? Well, because there are 6,000 types of aliens. So that's just what came through this week. I don't know.
No, that's fair enough. Um, is there a certain way that you address any kind of skepticism and criticism from those who question the legitimacy of your interest in the UFO subject?
I haven't encountered any of that recently. Strangely enough. Maybe it's not
Excellent.
strange.
Yeah.
Um, I have met many people. I mean, I don't necessarily proselytize about UFOs. I don't talk about it that much in my personal life, but
Right.
um, I have met many people who are like, well, for instance, I was at a girls' soccer game talking to one of the dads, nice, friendly guy. And he said, "Well, what have you been doing lately?" "Well, I've been, podcasting and doing research and things like that." "Oh, well, what have you been following?" I said, "Well, I've been following the UAP story." What UAP?" I was like, "UFOs. They're real." And he's like, "UFOs? Really?" So there are a lot of people out there who seem to have just completely missed it,
Yeah.
that I mean, hey, by the way, the US government has a task force investigating this and I mean, and then there are also some very muddy waters in terms of disclosure, right? And I'm sure you would agree with that. Has disclosure happened or not? Or is it a process? Where are we with that? That's interesting, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier sort of the 2017, the New York Times, how it almost kind of seemed like a big sea change in the UFO world. And since then we've had 3 consecutive years of legislation in the National Defense Authorization Acts. We've had 2 public UAP reports. So I just wondered, what do you think about all of that? That the government, after being involved in this subject for 75 plus years, are suddenly now taking it seriously and wanting to be transparent about it. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about the government. Again, I have a lot of defense connections, and so I know that community very well.
Okay.
I would say in general, as a rule, that it is not the big monolithic entity looking to squash information that people think. I mean, any government is a collection of people. There's turnover. That's one of the things that people forget. For instance, a lot of the Cold War era folks that probably knew this a little bit better are gone. Today's people are really, they came up in the information technology space, like myself. They started out with internet stuff. And so the way they approach problems is through information, and they're not focused on UFOs. They're focused on, is Russia hacking us? So I would imagine that for the vast majority of people in government, this UFO thing is just as disconcerting as it is for the average person on the street. Um, I've heard a lot of rumors, some of which I can repeat, some of which I can't. But I would say that the most credible rumors I've heard from some very high-ranking people are that the people who should be studying this, who are studying this, don't really know a heck of a lot more than you or I do. They're just trying to figure things out, and they've been caught off guard as much as anybody else.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the government, um, not surprisingly, they've treated this like an exception, I guess, and maybe rightfully so for decades. A pilot comes in and says, "Hey, I saw something strange," and they're like, "Okay, how much have you had to drink?"
Yeah.
Well, so they've been sweeping it under the rug, and now they have to deal with it. And I think one of the problems is they don't entirely know what they have to deal with either.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are certain credible people, such as Gary Nolan, like you mentioned earlier, that are talking about whistleblowers coming forward, speaking to Congress, speaking to Arrow about potential crash retrieval programs. What are your thoughts on that side of things?
I don't know. I don't know. Um, I guess what I could tell you, it's no surprise, is the most credible book. I have friends in the Air Force who have said that it sounds legit. Is the Corso book, right? Which
Okay,
everybody has read, and um, I've met people who have worked in areas like that who have read it who said, "Yep, that sounds like government." But at the same time, he actually did work in those areas. So if he was going to write a book about what it's like to work in the Air Force and the Pentagon, well, yeah, he was there, so he would know. Um, that doesn't necessarily make it true. It's difficult to know what has kind of come and gone in the past, I guess. I did an interview with Brent Ziarnik, and that's on my channel. And he dug through the Air Force archives, and he found tons and tons and tons of stuff about UFOs, but he didn't find anything that's not public. You know,
sure.
so it's all out there. And one of the things that he had mentioned, he was able, just because of his role and his rank and things like that, he was able to look at the uncensored, unredacted versions of things that are in FOIA reports. And even then, he said that very little is redacted that isn't out there. And the stuff that's redacted wouldn't be interesting to anybody. So, it's, yeah, there are so many unknowns. I would say at this point, everyone is asking the big questions. And I think that's a good thing. It kind of gives us an opportunity to maybe restart on this.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what we really need is just that breakthrough, big piece of evidence that really does change the kind of face of it all and moves us on to that next step. So yeah, I think
Well,
it's ongoing.
one thing that interested me also was Sean Kirkpatrick, right? Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who's in charge of Arrow. He co-authored a paper a couple of months ago with Avi Loeb, and it was about Oumuamua, and they had talked about the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, and could the interstellar asteroid have actually been some kind of a transport vehicle or something into collect, coming in to collect data or something like that.
Mm,
And the paper itself was interesting. Folks can look that up pretty easily online, but it also seemed like a form of signaling to me that the man who was in charge of that program would put his name on something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that he believes, so to speak, but
sure.
I think to me it was a signal that he's open to the possibility. He's not going to immediately clamp down on it and say this isn't real. um, and I think in the hearing, a lot of people were worried about that because they see them asking questions, right? He played a couple of videos and he said, "This one we can't identify. This one we can identify. Look, it's a plane." Um, although what is interesting in that hearing, what the video that he played they couldn't identify was, I understand that was the Mosul sphere,
Sure.
which is one of many reported sightings of those spheres. Apparently, those Predator drones have spotted several of those in the Middle East over the last few years. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems that we have orbs seem to be the flavor of the year. Maybe let's say we've moved on from triangles and tic tacs and saucers. So I find that quite fascinating that we're now into this realm of orbs.
I've wondered if maybe those are surveillance probes for the Tic Tac, right? Like the Tic Tac is the mothership or something along those lines, and the orbs are just little surveillance drones. Maybe because they're less noticeable, it just sends it out to record data or something. Um,
Yeah,
It could be.
could
I
be. Why
mean,
not?
well, and there was just that report that came out again. I think this was last month, like mid-May, about I forgot the name of the ship, but this was around where the Nimitz was. You're probably familiar with this one, right? This was the 2019
Sure. Yeah.
encounter. Yeah, and they just had the radar sensor data that was leaked. That just hit the news, and so that was more of these orbs. It appears, and it
Yeah.
was right around
Absolutely.
where the Nimitz was.
Yeah. It does seem strange that these are occurring in what people would call hotspots, I suppose. Yeah, it's fascinating. One thing I wanted to bring up is that by the time this interview goes live on YouTube, which will be tomorrow, Wednesday, the 31st, we'd have just had the latest NASA meeting on unidentified anomalous phenomena, the independent study team, with, I think it's about a 4-hour meeting. Have you been following sort of the work NASA's been doing over the past sort of 9 to 12 months?
Not closely, no.
Okay.
NASA seems to be trailing the military on this,
Yeah.
and they do have an independent effort. I hope that, they're able to do, the best job possible, but I don't have any big expectations there. I'm just not sure what they have to work with, you know? It would be nice for them to go back through mission footage and look for some of these anomalies, but at the same time, a lot of things have been spotted in those, and people have said that's a UFO, and it turns out that it's a piece of foam insulation or something. So even if NASA goes hunting for it, they may not find it or they may not be able to identify it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the purpose of the meeting tomorrow is to sort of say, whether they are going to go forward and do a full study or not. So personally, I'm not expecting much to come from the meeting other than a yes, going forward, we are going to do more work, rather than a we don't think it's worth it, which would be highly disappointing.
Well, one of the things that also interests me, and this goes to, I think, a much larger issue, right? Somewhat in the UK, perhaps, but absolutely in the United States, which is I think that the UFO, the UAP story it's not the only one, but I think that this is one of the biggest stories that goes to trust in government, you know?
Sure.
And the reason I mention that now is you'd mentioned NASA, but Gary McKinnon has said point blank that NASA has a history of, digitally airbrushing out UFOs from pictures. Um, and so it would be interesting to see them go through and say, "Hey, have we been editing photos?" Um, I think that's important because this is one of the few opportunities that these organizations have to, restore trust in government. I mean, again, this kind of goes off the UAP track a little bit, but I think that in a weird way, that's a larger issue than UAP. UAP, it looks like they're here, they've been here, they're probably not causing trouble. They're probably just studying us, right? But
Yeah.
the fact that our elected representatives are hiding that's a problem. That's a big problem. And the fact that everyone knows that, and over the last 70 years, again, that's one of several different things that has eroded public trust in government, you know? Um, and then it leads to other questions also. I mean, for instance, like we were talking about Christianity and demons earlier. Well, if the second coming of Christ happened, would we know about it or would it get covered up?
Good point. Yeah. It's food for thought.
Yeah, I think that there's a major trust in government issue. I mean, government it's in the United States, it's for the people, by the people, right? Um, so who is making these decisions to hide things? And again, I don't think that today's government officials necessarily even know. I think that there's a long history of decisions that are made. I think part of it needs to be, I think that there needs to be accountability. I think that there also needs to be some historical reckoning there, right?
Yeah.
And I know that the US government has started to do this on other issues, in many other historical ways. The British government has done this, right? They've gone back through and said, "We made decisions, sometimes in the 1600s that weren't the best, and the Canadian government has done that with regards to the Aboriginals. So it's one of those things where people make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are compounded. Sometimes they're based on policies, but at the same time, if they want to restore public trust, there needs to be more openness and more honesty. And I'm not entirely sure if we're seeing that now. For instance, the classified reports, right? So we have a private, we have a public report, which is what, 16 pages long, I think, 6 pages long, and then
Yeah.
we have a classified report, and then senators and congressmen walk out of the report room stunned. What is it that we're not hearing?
And why? Yeah. Why are we not allowed that information? And I agree with what you said. I think as well, it's never too late to change and start to bring transparency and trust back to the general public, no matter what country it is. So again, some great points there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and again, the reason I mention that is, I think this goes to the last election, right, in the U.S., the 2020 election. Um, my view is no matter what side you're on, half the population thinks the other half of the population was cheating, right?
sure. Yeah.
And so there's a major schism there, and it all goes back to trust in government. And the UAP phenomena, the UFO area, is one thing that they could score an absolute home run with. And if they don't soon, that trust may be eroded completely. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'd like to get into a bit of the sort of talk on propulsion, if that's okay with you. Now, I'm not particularly scientifically minded, so you'll have to bear with me. Um, but I'd like to start by, we've talked about these objects, UAP being, potentially non-human intelligence, but could it be possible that some foreign adversarial country has leapfrogged the rest of the world, and this could be the reason for why we're seeing these objects?
no, I absolutely don't see that. I absolutely don't see that. So I know, and I have worked with some of the top engineers, physicists, I mean, you name it, top experts in that field. In terms of, for instance, China, right, is fielding a lot of new jet fighters. Um, they look very advanced. In some ways, they are. The engines on those fighters are actually 30 years older than ours. They're completely outdated. So a lot of it is kind of smoke and mirrors, right? It's they have a mixture of contemporary as well as older technologies, but in terms of performance, they are way beyond or way behind us. Russia is much the same. And if you look at how those countries are actually performing in the field, right? Um, China is very obviously, I mean, they're relying on balloons, the
Yeah.
weather, the quote unquote weather balloons. So, if China was going to have these spy vehicles, we know what they would look like. We were shooting them down in February. They would be big balloons, and they would send them over, and they're doing it to send a message as well as collect information. In terms of Russia, if I understand correctly, Russia has made it down to, I believe it's the T-34 tank in Ukraine. So they've exhausted all of their modern era tanks. Apparently, they used up all of their Vietnam era tanks. They've made it back to World War II era tanks that they're fielding in Ukraine. So neither one of these countries is on the cutting edge. And again, that's no surprise. They don't spend as much as we do. China has a much larger standing army, but in terms of what they put into that, um, I mean, they're starting from way behind. They're just not there, you know. So I don't see either of those countries having any chance. I would call it 0% chance of these being foreign, and I don't see any other countries doing it either.
Yeah.
There aren't any tiny, like, Argentina or Brazil or anything like that. None of them have the resources to put together this kind of technology. So then that leaves the question of, if not them, then who?
Yeah.
Is it American technology? Well, Various people have said these are US black programs, and I've heard many reasons to disagree with that as well. One of them is these encounters disrupted a lot of training exercises and put pilots at risk. And so that's not something, even if these things just landed at Area 51, that's the kind of thing that people go to prison for because it
Sure.
endangers the lives of US service members, you know?
Mm.
But some of the other aspects of this, for instance, the Aguadilla sighting, we saw a vehicle enter the water. I believe it was tracking something like 60 to 100 miles an hour, something like that, go into the water and come back out. There appears to be shape shifting. Kevin Newth described accelerations at thousands of Gs. These are things that are not physically possible with any technology. I mean, people don't take into account it's not just the drive system. Like, for instance, uh, the Nimitz UAPs, they spotted these on the incoming ballistic missile radar, right, in
Sure. Yep.
space. They went from space down to surface level in a matter of seconds. So even if we had some kind of a secret project that could do that, the acceleration wouldn't just kill a pilot, it would destroy any airframe. It would just crumple it. And even if they had some kind of a super airframe that could take it, the speed itself would result in a massive fireball, and you would end up ablating the surface of any, shielding that you had. I mean, it's kind of like the space shuttle, right? When you have something like that come back in, it has to come down at a slower speed. Otherwise, it
Mm.
will just destroy itself, you know? And even meteorites, same thing. When they enter the atmosphere, they're coming in fast, they burn up. That's why most of them don't hit the ground. These things didn't burn up. So there's technology that is so far beyond ours that it's not even close. I don't see this as being anything from Earth. And I think that may be John Ramirez has said that there may be some kind of announcement in September. Maybe that's the announcement. Maybe somebody in government, maybe the Aero will finally say, look, these things can't be from Earth because the performance that's been reported and documented, it's not even close.
Right. I mean, just to give us an idea then, what are some of the most promising advanced propulsion technologies currently being researched, by us?
Well, so there are a lot of different avenues in gravity modification that are being explored, right? And a lot of that comes out of experimental stuff. For instance, one well-known one is back in 1989, Dr. Evgeny Poglanov or Eugene Poglanov, he indicated that a rotating superconductor appeared to have a column of smoke that lost weight above it. Anything in this column, right, of like steam above this superconductor lost weight, and they went up to different floors in the building and measured it. He did subsequent experiments with what he called a force beam generator, where he basically used a massive discharge of electricity onto a superconductor, and he claimed that it produced a force beam capable of crumpling metal. It was very powerful, but very brief as well. So that's one area that a lot of research has been done. There was a lady named Dr. Ning Lee,
Yeah.
University of Huntsville, and she worked on that for several years. I understand that she just passed of cancer a couple of years ago, so her research is presumably gone now. And from what I understand, not much was accomplished in the last few years. But so superconductors are definitely one area where there have been reports. Another is B-field Brown effect. I understand there's a company called Ivo that's actually fielding something on a space launch in this month, and that'll be a big first. This is asymmetrical capacitance. Again, the B-field Brown effect, which has been dismissed as being ion wind. Those things tend to go together. It's very difficult to test them separately. And so a space test is one of the only ways to test it without having air present to
Right.
write it off as ion wind. Um, so that'll be interesting to see what happens with as well. Another one is the Searle effect, right? Which again goes back to, I think, the 1960s. Now, John Searle has been written off by so many people as a charlatan. It's humorous at this point. And yet, everyone who builds a replication notices strange effects. There were a couple of researchers in Russia, Sergei Godin and Vladimir Roshin, who tested it in the 90s, I believe. And they said that they saw self-spin. In their case, they weren't they made changes to their device compared to his, and so they weren't able to get what they were hoping for. But basically, what they reported in a scientific paper was the onset of many of the same things that Searle had claimed happened. There was another experiment by Paul Murad and John Brandenburg in the early 2000s, and they reported seeing anomalous effects as well. So, that's yet another example. A friend of mine, Mark Sokol, is working with something else entirely, which is EPR, or nuclear magnetic resonance. And that is the idea that basically, if you can align the nucleus of atoms, you may be able to utilize precession for forward thrust. And you may be able to do other things as well, depending on whose physics you subscribe to. So that's something that I think is a very interesting and promising area. And I think we'll see more about that in the next few months. Yeah, I mean, that's 4 different ways, and there are probably 50 out there,
Yeah.
that are being actively researched, and hundreds more that have been talked about.
Yeah, I was looking into it today, doing some research, and the amount that I came across was overwhelming. As you said, there are so many. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of warp drive as a form of kind of travel for these objects?
Well, so Dr. Jack Sarfati, claims he has what's called the weightless warp drive. He claims that's exactly what they're using. There was a fellow named Thorsten. He was a German fellow, and he created a website called UAP Theory. Sorry, I'm trying to remember because he put the site up. It was I'm not sure if you ever saw it, but
Not
for
sure.
for a period of about a year and a half, it was almost like a Bible for warp drive, UAP warp drive. You know what, Vinny, I can send you a copy,
Please.
and if the audience emails me, I'll send them a copy as well. Um, yeah, I archived a copy of the whole site. What he did was he did close-up animated GIFs of some of the things. He used the Aguadilla video, which is one of the SCU's better videos.
Yeah.
And again, it shows an object entering the water and coming out. It also shows it shows the object appearing to split in two and a lot of other interesting things. So what he said was that was a warp drive, which instead of pushing an aircraft through, instead of like an action reaction type of propulsion, it's changing the geodesic of space, right? So basically, it creates an area of higher gravity above itself or in front of itself and falls into it. It's actually changing time space. It's warping time space. The Alcubierre warp drive is probably the best known example of
Yeah.
this. And there may be dozens of variations on that are out there. I've seen many different write-ups, and I've seen it explained in string and brain theory and, attempts at quantum theory. So it's one of those ideas that everybody has kind of approached from different angles. Well,
Yes.
Thor claimed that the UAP was using this type of warp drive to actually warp time and space as its form of propulsion in anti-gravity. And if that's the case, they very well could go faster than the speed of light. Or close enough to it that, it would at the very least radically change the way that we perceive interstellar trips or, trips
Sure.
between stars at least. Uh, One of the other things that he thought he saw, and this was the reason that I saved his site, was when the object splits in two, he claimed that that was gravitational lensing. And
Okay.
when I looked at that, I said, "Oh, yeah, because if you're creating an area of changed gravity, if you're warping time and space around the craft, it's likely that that will change light that's going through it. And so the object splitting in two, it may not have actually split in two. It may have just been a warping of what we saw coming out of it because time is warped, space is warped.
Right.
So that intrigued me because one of these very common reports about UAP is, well, they changed shape, right? Or it was a sphere, then it was an egg, it was this, it was that. And I'm like, maybe they didn't change shape. Maybe if they're using this warp drive, maybe it just depends on where they're going, how you view them. Maybe it's a sphere the whole time, or a saucer the whole time. Who knows?
That's fascinating, and to me that makes sense. So, yeah, that's wonderful. I think this is a great point of the interview for you to tell us about APEC.
Ah, okay. Well, and I appreciate you letting me plug it. I've got, as you can see on my screens behind me,
Yep.
during the pandemic, when we all thought we were going to die, stockpiling toilet paper, uh, I was approached by Mark Sokol and a couple of other fellows, and they said, Tim, they said, back in the day, you used to run this American Anti-Gravity, and they said, we want to put on a conference, and you're the only person who can moderate it. And again, at first I turned him down. I said, UFOs might be bad mojo. I was like, I'm not sure if the world is kind of ready for this kind of a conference. But they were persistent and they came back. And so we started it, and the first couple of conferences were it was insane and yet magical, right? It was and I think that the magic of APEC is something that probably applies in the UAP community. It can apply to a lot of different communities where uh, you have people who have been interested in this and researching this for decades coming together to actually talk all in the same place at the same time for the first time. And so for the first few of those, we had some of the real old timers from that community. They didn't know how to use Zoom. They were new to the whole thing. And they were like, oh my God, I'm on a conference and here are all of my heroes. Here are all the people I talked to. Um, so that's where APEC started. And then we leveraged our network, we leveraged connections, and we started to get presentations by various PhDs and subject matter experts. And we've tried to kind of grow things since then. Early on, it was called the Woodstock of anti-gravity. And I've tried to kind of keep that, close to my heart, where we cover a lot of UAP stuff. Probably half of the material in the conference is related to UAP or about UAP.
Wow.
And then the other half is more traditional. Um, by traditional, again, we've got warp drives, gravity modification, a lot of inertial propulsion, off-center rotator stuff, people actually building things. We have lab time where people demonstrate things that they've built. So there's a lot going on there. And after probably about a 6-month hiatus, we are restarting the conference, a slightly new format, and we've restructured things a little bit. And then we're going to be doing basically a conference once a month and then kind of an open mic session every 2 weeks. And that allows these different parts of the community, I guess, to interact better because you have PhDs, engineers who are writing papers on how it should be built, how UAPs work, things like that, as well as people actually building things. And they don't always speak the same language. So
Right.
having these two different sessions lets them communicate in the best way for them, I guess.
Wow, that's amazing. And are these open to the public?
Yeah, yeah. So I would urge anyone to visit altpropulsion.com and register for APEC. We have a web form. It goes to a secure email capture. That's it. We don't spam people. We don't rent the list, anything like that. We've been doing that since I think the first 6 months of the conference. Uh, and what we do is typically we send out two announcements, one like 3 or 4 days before, and then one the day of, just as kind of a last minute, hey, you should be there. And that's about it. Other than that, we really don't send much email. In fact, we probably should
Fantastic.
send more than we do, but
I understand completely. But yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that all of the links of yours are in the description of this so people can go and check it out. And I suppose before we finish, I just wanted to ask you if you have any more sort of UAP related interviews coming up on your wonderful YouTube channel.
oh, well, thank you. And so yeah, that's I mean, I guess if people look up the Tim Ventura interviews, I've been trying to put them up as I can, I guess. I'm talking with George Knapp. I would like to do one with him. Um, Ross Coulthart. I'm in talks with him, although I understand he's on vacation, so he's been kind of slowing me down. Um, so those are two that I'm kind of working on, but I'm trying to kind of continue digging as well. And I think these recent, again, the Mosul sphere is interesting. For me, that's really new. I hadn't heard of that before the hearings.
Right.
And this leaked radar data from this other ship, those are both kind of breaking news stories. And so I would love to try and find more out about those. And I'm sure all of us will. I'm sure it'll
Yeah,
make headlines, So
absolutely. Well, listen, Tim, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation. I knew it was going to be. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
wonderful. Well, Vinny, thank you as well.
My pleasure. And thank you to everybody watching. As always, please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you don't already, and we will see you on the next show. Take care. Goodbye.